All right. So thank you again, everyone who joined us today. So today we have a very special webinar, The Humanoid Tipping Point, a disruption no one is ready for, with Dr. Graham Ong-Webb from RSIS. Graham has been joining our NYU Riskathon simulation with this class for 3 years now. And other than that, he's a senior vice president at Kroll, New York-headquartered risk consultancy. He's also the head of operations for the Intelligence and Investigation Service Line covering Southeast Asia. He previously served as VP and head of the Future Technology Center at Singapore Technologies, ST Engineering, spearheading strategic advanced technology initiatives for one of Asia's largest engineering conglomerates. So, Graham, thank you so much for joining us today, and really looking forward to this talk.
Thank you very much, Tally, for that wonderful introduction. And good day to all of you from all across the world. I just want to say it's a privilege to be with you this evening, well, from where we are in Singapore, where I am currently, and to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about what I think is a significant topic. There are many important topics out there, but I think this is one of the topics which is keeping me awake lately, the humanoid tipping point. So without further ado, I will dive right into it. So can we go into the next slide, please? Thank you. So let me begin by framing the core question behind this webinar. I would say that for decades, we assumed humanoid robots were a distant possibility, science fiction, the stuff of movies, something for the far horizon. But the assumption in my assessment is now obsolete. Advances in very specific areas such as physical artificial intelligence or physical AI, which is something I'll talk about in more detail, and other areas of development such as generalist robotic models and low-cost locomotion are collapsing timelines far faster than policymakers, companies, or societies can expect. I would say that we're now looking at the prospect of humanoid robots emerging not in decades, as we previously postulated, but I would say in as little as a few years. Now, when that happens, the disruption will not be linear by any stretch. It will be, first of all, sudden. It will be quite uneven, but it will be system-wide. It will touch labor markets, national security, defense matters, geopolitics, regulatory systems, social stability, and so on. And it will do so at a pace that no current institution is designed currently, as we speak, to absorb. So here, this smorgasbord of issues that we'll be talking about is why we're here today. And we're going to focus on these issues in terms of that inflection that we should be thinking about, the tipping point, to determine whether how ready are we as societies in being able to manage and navigate through yet another important milestone in civilizational development. It will be a risk for many societies, but it will also be a game changer and opportunities for other societies as well. And this is something that I look forward in hearing your points about by the end of this presentation. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to ground this discussion in something very tangible. Because of the current limitations of virtual webinars, what I'll do is, can we have the next slide, please? What we'll do is we will, I put before you several short video clips. Now, the URLs or the internet hyperlinks to these clips, there are 3 which I've curated. I've placed them in the chat bar of this Zoom webinar. And I would like you to, after my short brief on the matter, to just toggle over and perhaps watch at least one, if not just quickly canvas or scan through a couple of videos. These are demonstrations of humanoid systems. Some are marketing videos, but I think they make the point. These are machines that exist today. They're operating with real sense of physical balance, real manipulation capability, and real autonomy in unstructured environments. So I'd encourage you to spend a few minutes to watch 1 or 2 of these clips. Choose any that catch your eye. We have 2 American-based robotic initiatives, the first and the second. And then we have XPeng, which is a Chinese technology company now famous for its electric vehicles, which has just recently fielded its Iron robot, which is the third clip. So I encourage you to have a look at these videos and circle back in the next couple of minutes. If there are no abstentions, I think we will just proceed. I hope you had a chance to just get a cursory glance of some of these clips. These videos, I think, communicate something that words alone can't. I think it's important to get a sense of the physicality, the dexterity, and the underlying intelligence, presumably because there's only so much you can also discern from videos, that I think are converging far faster than most of us realize. So let's go on to the next slide. Let me start by taking us back to the way robotics used to work, and I think to a large degree continue to work within the prevailing model of industrial robotics. I think it's important to understand this contrast because it's essential to appreciate the scale of change that we're now living through. By the way, before we proceed, can anyone tell me which three countries have the highest industrial robotic densities in the world today? Just a quick question. Well, if your answer is circling around South Korea, you would be right. If it would be China, you would also be right. And also within the basket of the top three, at least in terms of the number of industrial robots per 10,000 employees, Singapore actually comes in third. So in terms of robotic concentration, South Korea is at number one, roughly over 1,000 industrial robots per 10,000 employees in manufacturing. And then, of course, Singapore comes in quite close at around 750 robots thereabout per 10,000 employees. And China is catching up in that proportion in terms of about just under 500 robots. But if you look at robotics, industrial robots in absolute numbers, which I think is important because we've got to take into account the overall labor force and the overall scale of the manufacturing sector per country, China does come in at number one. Its total factory robotic fleet surpassed about 2 million robots by 2024, so making it the country with the highest absolute number of industrial robots. Now, in the old or prevailing robotics paradigm, vis-a-vis industrial robotics, these robots have to be programmed step by step. Every angle of motion, every grasp, every trajectory through space has to be manually specified by an engineer. It has to be coded into the system via software. And so it's easier to take it for granted, the enormity and the intricacy of computer programming that has to go in order to make even the simplest task possible through a chain of micro instructions. So if you wanted a robot to perform something mundane, like heating up a sandwich, you couldn't simply tell it to just do that, heat up a sandwich. You had to write new code for every stage of the process, where to find a sandwich, how to pick it up, how to navigate to the microwave oven, if that was a choice for heating up sandwich, how to open the door, how long to heat it, and what to do if something unexpected happened. In other words, every new task was a software project and continues to be a software project within the prevailing paradigm. This is the reason why, despite the robotic densities I just talked about in countries like South Korea and Singapore and China, these robots have never left the manufacturing plants and the factory floors. They are powerful, but yet they are highly limited. They operate very well in only very highly controlled environments, which are highly structured and highly predictable. The moment you walk into real world conditions, the world of messiness, of clutter, of ambiguity, just simple variations, or even the unpredictability of how we move as human beings and how we move in a physical space, the whole entire system will break down for the prevailing robotic paradigm. So the outside world for the longest time was simply too complex for rule-based robotics to handle. And this limitation defined robotics for nearly 50 years. Next slide. Now let's look at what has changed. Because the shift is nothing short of transformational, over the past 3 years, we have entered an entirely new robotics paradigm. Instead of robots being programmed step by step, we now have foundational models for the physical world. Models that learn how to move, manipulate, and interact with objects in the same way large language models learn to use language. So I think that's an interesting proxy or metaphor to use against and trying to understand this notion of physical AI, which we'll talk about. in the very same way we've come to imbibe ChatGPT or DeepSeek um, and other models like it. In the same vein, this newfound set of models that underpin physical AI has completely changed the entire game. So because of physical AI, which I'll talk more about in a moment, we've been able to move from traditional programming to actual learning. We have moved away from scripts to reasoning, and we've moved from rigid automation to adaptable intelligence. These new models are trained on millions of demonstrations, billions of frames of video, and vast simulated environments. They don't rely on precise hard-coded instructions anymore. They rely only on generalization, the ability to take what they've seen before, or at least through the sensors that feed data to the algorithms, and to apply it to new, unfamiliar situations. And that is one of the breakthroughs, which is completely amazing or extremely terrifying, depending on how you look at it. Because for the first time, robots are beginning to understand intent the way we do understand intent, rather than just following instructions. They can infer what needs to be done, plan the steps ahead, and adapt when environment changes. This is the foundation of physical AI, and it unlocks the kind of real-world capability that traditional robotics could never achieve. Slide next. Let me bring this to life with a very simple illustration. Heating up a sandwich is an example I always like to use in these kinds of discussions. In the old robotics paradigm, and I sort of inferred that earlier, the task was impossible unless engineers wrote a long list of step-by-step instructions, where the sandwich is, how to pick it up, how to open the microwave, etc., etc. Right? In other words, a human had to anticipate every detail in advance. But in this new paradigm of physical AI, the robot approaches this task the very same way we do. First, it interprets the intent. The goal is to warm up a sandwich. Secondly, it activates world knowledge. A sandwich is food, heating requires a microwave, and if it's wrapped in foil, foil can't go inside a microwave. Third, it uses perception to locate the sandwich, identify the microwave, assess the surroundings, etc. Fourth, it then has to plan a sequence of actions. Pick up the sandwich, navigate to the microwave, open the door, insert it, set the timer, and so on. And finally, it executes the plan with continuous feedback, adjusting its grip, avoiding obstacles, and adapting if something unexpected happens. The critical point I'm trying to make here is this. The robot is no longer following a script. It's reasoning physically through the task, interpreting intent, understanding context, and making decisions autonomously. This is the leap that we are interested in, because this is where the game changer really lies, becoming more and more like who we are. And it's the essence of physical AI. Robots that can handle real-world tasks the same way we do, rather than the way machines were traditionally instructed to do. Slide next. Now that we've seen the sandwich example, let's take a moment to look under the hood, because what's happening inside these systems is both elegant and profound. A modern humanoid robot isn't driven by one single model. It operates through a stack of intelligence layers, each of which contributes a different form of understanding. Slide next. At the top, a language model interprets an instruction. When you say, heat up my sandwich, it understands the intention behind the words, not just the literal phrasing. Below that, a world model presides. It provides semantic knowledge, what a sandwich is, what a microwave does, which objects are safe or unsafe to heat, and what sequence of actions make sense. Then comes the perception layer. And this comes into being, taking inputs from cameras, depth sensors, tactile sensors to understand what is actually in front of the robot, the position of the sandwich, the orientation of the microwave door, the shape of the handle, and so on. The task planner then, which is another layer, then breaks the goal into a step-by-step plan, much like a human mapping out a routine. It figures out the precise order of actions required to achieve the intended outcome. And finally, at the bottom of the stack, low-level controllers translate these plans into smooth, adaptive motion, constantly adjusting grip, balance, trajectory, and speed in response to real-time feedback from the environment. This multi-layered stack is what allows a robot to operate in messy, unpredictable human spaces, be it kitchens, warehouses, hospitals, construction sites, maybe in the near future battlefields, places where traditional robots simply cannot function. Now, the key takeaway is that physical AI is not a single breakthrough. It is a system, so a systemic breakthrough involving an inflection of different technology stacks. So this is an integrated intelligence architecture. I mean, behind all this simplification is immense finesse and great sophistication that brings the best minds in the world in order to create this whole amalgamation of technologies coming together in the form of a humanoid robot. And so it combines perception, reasoning, planning, control, and all these other attributes which are essential. And this is what allows robots to generalize across tasks and adapt as conditions change. And this is what makes sudden scaling possible, which is the reason why I had to walk you through this primer. Now, next slide, please. One of the most important shifts I want to emphasize is this. Once again, we no longer write code for motion. For 50 years, robotics was fundamentally an engineering discipline. It no longer is. It's more the stuff of very specific growing discipline of artificial intelligence involving a new generation of computer programmers and scientists. Now, if you want a robot to perform a task, in the past you wrote the instructions, as I mentioned, but today that whole era is over. So robots are just constantly learning entities. They learn motor skills, manipulation techniques, tool use, and how to innovate and use new tools within its physical domain. And entire behaviors from vast data sets and in simulation environments. And the rate of learning is accelerating as we speak. These systems improve through massive parallel simulation, millions of synthetic demonstrations. So these are hypothetical synthetic demonstrations that never have to take place in the real world, but can just simply take place in the mind of the robot, if you will, at the level of the algorithm. Continuous self-improvement loops and shared updates across entire fleets of robots. Now, this final attribute hasn't quite happened yet, but it will soon happen. For those of you who have watched the Apple TV series Pluribus, you might get a sense of what this hive mentality may be like, albeit here in this case in human form in the TV series. But the point is being made here that a hive of robots can actually share their learning across each other through and perhaps infinite space across the world, right? And be able to pick up skills and to apply those skills even without physically having had to learn through that sort of task prior to picking up said skills. So if we factor in cloud computing and next generation connectivity, a behavior mastered by one robot can be transferred to thousands overnight. A new skill learned in simulation can appear in the physical world the very next day. So this is a completely different development curve from traditional robotics. It's exponential, it's compounding, and in the cloud computing era, in the era of next generation connectivity, it will be shared. So when you tell a robot, heat up my sandwich, you are giving it an intention and the robot figures out the rest. This is a very simple example, but it's extremely powerful. And you could think about a lot of other use cases and almost every aspect of our physical activity to think about how a robot will actually navigate through that. Next slide, please. Now, intelligence alone doesn't produce a tipping point. I want to talk very quickly about the hardware side of the story. To see real-world humanoids at scale, the hardware must also be ready. And for the first time, it is. Over the last 5 years alone, we've witnessed dramatic improvements in the physical components that make humanoid robots possible. I may not have time to go into all the details, but in terms of what you see over here, a very good summary about how things like the actuators have become more powerful, more lightweight, cheaper to build, so therefore they're scaled. The edge computing has come a long way from the past, reducing latency, increasing reliability, enabling real-time decision making, which is very important when it comes to speed of movement, and making it as seamless as possible, the very way we behave quite seamlessly as human beings, like heating up a sandwich in a microwave oven. And finally, the cost curve is shifting. Component prices are falling rapidly, driven by automotive supply chains and large-scale Chinese manufacturing, among others. This is what makes mass deployment economically viable soon to come. In other words, the hardware is no longer the bottleneck. It used to be in the past. It actually now has become an enabler or accelerant in this story. So when you combine rapidly advancing physical AI with the hardware we just talked about, then you come to appreciate that capable, robust, and affordable robotics is just around the corner at this moment of convergence. Next slide, please. Now that we've covered the breakthroughs in intelligence and hardware, the natural question is, will scaling be sudden? Why not gradual, like the way most technologies have unfolded thus far? Well, the answer is that humanoid robots do not scale like traditional machines. So one of the things I would like us to sort of decouple from is to use this traditional model of, incremental developmentalism, which I suppose is quite linear in its construct. I would say that a better way to think about the evolution of humanoid robotics would be to think about how AI has evolved in scale. So AI adoption curves are also non-linear, and I think they are a very good proxy to understand how humanoid robotics will also evolve. So first of all, humanoid robots operate in environments that humans have already built. They don't require new infrastructure, new layouts, or equipment. The moment they are competent enough, they can walk into any existing home, warehouses, factories, hospitals, etc., and start adding value. So the moment the transition or socialization period is actually going to be very, very short, very tight. I would say that by virtue of how we have conceived of humanoid robots, the world is actually ready for them to take part in. Secondly, the underlying intelligence is shared, right? So when I mentioned earlier, when one robot learns a new skill, every robot can inherit that ability instantly. Third is the cost curve I talked about. So one of the things I want you to hold on to is that the price point as we speak currently is within the range of between 70,000 US dollars to 150,000 US dollars. Right? At those prices, deployment is still limited to pilots and demonstrations. But every major player in this space, whether it's Tesla or Figure, like in the video, or Sanctuary, or leading Chinese manufacturers like Xpeng and others, is targeting an inflection price of around US dollars 20,000 to 30,000 per robot. That is the moment many observers seem to concur on, that a humanoid robot becomes economically substitutable for a full-time human worker in many labor-intensive sectors. Now, if I were building a disruption or risk forecasting model, I would treat US dollar 20,000 to 30,000 as the realistic threshold where large-scale adoption begins, but I would treat $15,000 to $20,000 as the best-case scenario under aggressive optimization and manufacturing scale conditions, which I think is entirely possible. So anything below $15,000 will require a breakthrough in actuators, power systems, or sensors. I appreciate that, and we haven't really arrived there at this point, but I think this is quite probable. So, but even if we think about $20,000 to $30,000 as a band, it's enough to trigger a rapid shift. Once a humanoid robot becomes cheaper to acquire and operate than hiring and retaining or retraining, sorry, a human worker, especially in sectors with labor shortages, rising wages, or high turnover, adoption behaves like a switch, I would say, will happen very suddenly, and companies will move quite immediately. And these assumptions help us to forecast the following. Number one, when robots become economically competitive with human labor. Number two, which sectors adopt first. Number three, why scaling is not incremental but sudden and system-wide. So the fourth point I want to make before we move on to the next slide is that capabilities will improve continuously. Every week, the model gets better. Every month, the hardware will improve, and the window between not viable and widely deployed is shrinking dramatically because of this. And this is something it is important to monitor, and there are many layers of the situation that we need to look at. Not just the tech stack, so to speak, but also the policy stack, the infrastructure stack, and all the other important layers that will lead to this very large inflection soon to come. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Now, let's talk about the various different tipping points that we need to consider. First of all, I think we do need to talk about the labor market, because this is where the most immediate and visible disruption will occur. When humanoid robots reach the capability and cost thresholds we've just discussed, they begin to compete directly with human labor across a wide range of sectors. The impact is not linear. I think it will cascade. It will have ripple effects, and the first wave will hit industries that are already struggling with labor shortages or high turnover. Logistics will be one, warehousing, manufacturing, retail operations, cleaning, security, food services, construction, and even elder care. Now, these sectors have several characteristics in common. The work will be physically repetitive, margins are tight, and employers face increasing challenges hiring and retaining workers. And I think humanoid robotics will fit into these roles almost immediately. But a second wave, I think, is more consequential. Once employers integrate humanoids into their workflows, whether it's scheduling, supervision, compliance, safety, etc., to be deeply embedded into those workflows, so to speak, I think the economic logic will shift. Hiring an additional robot becomes marginally easier and cheaper than hiring an additional human. Now, this creates a substitution loop. The more robots a company deploys, the cheaper and more efficient the system becomes, accelerating further adoption. So this kind of cycle that is mutually reinforcing. The third wave is structural. I think entire labor segments will begin to hollow out, not because humans cannot compete on skill, but because they cannot compete on costs, consistency, or availability. This doesn't eliminate human labor. I'm not saying that, but it will reshape the way we think about labor and labor as a force vector, pushing workers into supervisory, coordination type roles, dealing with exception handling, and also creative roles, while compressing opportunities in routine physical work, which will be outsourced to robotics essentially. So the key point I'm trying to make here is that labor markets will adjust slowly, but AI and robotics will adjust or inflect quickly. And I think this asymmetry or mismatch is what will create potential shocks. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the next basket, which is security. Both public safety and national security, among others. I know security is multifaceted, but we'll focus on these two bits for now, because humanoid robots will definitely transform both domains. And I can imagine that some of you in here in the audience, in thinking about labor and thinking about the issues, will also come to intuitively think about the impacts on security. Now, in public safety, the humanoid robotics will clearly become force multipliers. Why am I saying this? Because it's already becoming quite apparent. We're seeing here in Singapore and a lot of other developed cities and countries that we are seeing rollouts, we're seeing sandboxes, demonstration trials of some iteration of security robots. Now, they are not humanoid by any stretch. Currently, they're still wheeled or tracked. They're very limited in terms of their mobility and in terms of their articulation and degrees of freedom, but they are getting more advanced, and I think soon to come, they will be substituted with humanoids once the humanoids are soon to be ready. Now, such robots can clearly patrol in high-risk areas, serve as first responders, assist in search and rescue, and perform hazardous tasks like fire response, bomb disposal, or chemical exposure. Now, they extend the reach and capability of under-resourced security forces, but there's also a darker side that we need to think about. Just as beneficial capabilities scale quickly, I think we can also think about the malicious capabilities that can scale just as fast as well. So humanoids can be misused for physical intrusion and sabotage, surveillance and data collection, even clandestinely so, carrying out or deploying harmful payloads, and impersonating or carrying out social engineering activities in physical spaces. Now, we also face a new kind of ambiguity. A robot's behavior depends entirely on its software, which means compromise, misconfiguration, or deliberate manipulation can produce unpredictable outcomes. I mean, think of hacking a humanoid, and I think you can think about the risks that can manifest out of that. So at the national defense level, humanoid robots become logistical and operational assets. I think that would be the first step. They can carry equipment, repair infrastructure, transport supplies, but militaries will clearly not deploy them simply for the tail end of the warfighting machine. There's a lot of scholarship, analysis, literature that's growing out of this area about the projection into frontline tasks in terms of being armed with combative payloads, carrying out actual military operations, having lethal capabilities, and so forth. So these are things that clearly could be advantages from the standpoint of militaries, but we also have to think about the implications of and the risks inherent in humanoid robotics that come along with those kinds of capabilities that we want to bestow onto robotics. Let's move on to the next slide. So this final bit that we need to look at, which is geopolitics, very important to many of us. Let's take a step back and look at the landscape before us, because I think humanoid robots will reshape global power dynamics just as profoundly as they reshape labor markets and also the security landscape. The first shift, of course, I think comes from from a very important place. Ultimately, politics is about people. Geopolitics is about demographic change, on a significant scale. So countries with aging populations like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, parts of Europe, etc., suddenly gain a way to maintain productivity by adopting humanoids without relying on immigration or a shrinking workforce. Something to think about. This alters the economic trajectories that have been assumed for decades. The second shift is going to be about industrial advantages for those that have the robots and the industrial disadvantages that for those who don't. So countries that dominate the humanoid supply chain, so not just having the robots, but also having the supply chain to power and sustain robotics as a capability, will clearly wield a disproportionate amount of influence, similar to what semiconductor leaders hold today. China's manufacturing scale, America's AI leadership, and Japan and Korea's robotic expertise will become strategic assets for sure in this part of the story. I think the third shift is about military and strategic capability within the context of geopolitics. I think humanoids will increase a nation's ability to project power, maintain readiness, and recover from disruptions. This will create new asymmetries in defense planning. The fourth shift is going to be technological dependence. Countries that rely on foreign humanoids or foreign AI models, for that matter, will inherit new dependencies and new vulnerabilities in their national infrastructure. And finally, there's the soft power dimension. Nations that deploy humanoids effectively in healthcare, disaster response, public safety, and so on will shape the global narrative around this technology in terms of its norms and even its acceptable use. So I would say that geopolitical power has always been tied to various aspects of national power. We understand that. And I think the insertion of humanoid robotics will affect many aspects of national power. So this idea of a tipping point, as I've tried to come to have us appreciate, doesn't stem merely from the technological. I mean, it will come from the technological to begin with, but ultimately, I think it will be very geopolitical in nature. Next slide, please. Now, to make sense of a future that is changing this rapidly, we must adopt a structured approach. The best way to do that is to think in terms of scenarios. So using uncertainty, not prediction. I'm not asking us to gaze through a crystal ball, but to use it as our analytical anchor. And I think for humanoid robotics, two forces among other forces, I'm just focusing on two for the purposes of this discussion, will shape the decade ahead more than anything else. First will be the speed of humanoid rollout and adoption, whether scaling is gradual or explosive. And the second will be the degree of governance preparedness, whether we as people and the institutions that constitute societies and nation states will adapt in time or fall behind. Now, when we cross these two drivers, we get four plausible scenarios or four plausible worlds. Each one teaches something about risk, resilience, and strategic choice. So I must caveat that this is not an exhaustive scenario set, but I think it's a good starting point for us to have a conversation about where the world may go. It may go in many different directions, but here are four that I think are quite worth thinking about. Now, let me walk you through the first scenario, and the one that is ultimately, I think, the most desirable, arguably. It would be good to have your thoughts on this. This is the world which I call the world of accelerated stability. Humanoid adoption accelerates rapidly in this world, but crucially, our institutions are able to keep pace. Governments, regulators, companies, and the public all move in alignment and in lockstep. In this world, governments build regulatory frameworks early. They establish clear rules on safety, liability, data use, ethical employment, and so on. Corporates behave responsibly. They adopt humanoids, but they do so transparently with clear communication to workers and stakeholders. Public anxiety is addressed through structured transition pathways, wage insurance, and reskilling programs, among others. The result is that we have a society or societies that absorb disruption rather than resisting it. Now, humanoids begin to fill labor gaps in logistics, construction, those areas, those low-hanging fruit areas I talked about earlier, but this doesn't happen in a chaotic fashion, but through carefully planned integration aimed at strengthening national resilience. This is a world where productivity actually rises, demographic pressures ease, and the public trust remains intact. So what should we watch for signals or indicators that we're moving towards this kind of scenario? Next slide, please. First, governments publish, so if you keep your eye to the top left quadrant, you'll see a couple of indicators or signals popping up, and I think this is useful to refer to and build on if you're trying to track as to whether any one particular scenario is manifesting. And looking at the top right corner here and speaking to the indicators there, I think first of all, one of the key indicators or signals will be that governments will start publishing clear deployment roadmaps, outlining when and how humanoids will be introduced into different sectors. Second, there'll be a surge in public-private partnerships. There'll be collabs between robotic firms, training institutes, regulators, and so on. Third, I think we'll see harmonization of standards across regions. This will be a sign that countries are coordinating rather than competing on safety and interoperability. And fourth, a smooth rollout of large-scale upskilling programs designed to help workers transition into high-value roles will be something that you'll see happening. Now, even in such a scenario, though desirable, it will have its risks. If humanoid supply becomes concentrated in just a few dominant players, countries may face strategic dependency. If displacement occurs faster in certain sectors, political sensitivity may rise, even with good policies in place. But it comes with all those caveats. And in any major safety incident, whether caused by misuse or even a system error, these things could rapidly erode public trust. So this system can even though desirable, if you don't build in protective features and contingencies and workarounds, it could rapidly break down and erode public trust. So it's not a perfect situation, but nevertheless a desirable one. The second scenario, I would say, is more disruptive. In fact, the most disruptive, and perhaps even arguably the most dangerous. I call this second scenario the chaotic tipping point. In this world, humanoid adoption accelerates at extraordinary speed, but the institutions fail to keep up. Corporates automate aggressively in response to labor shortages and competitive pressure, but governments are caught flat-footed, they're caught off guard. No regulatory frameworks, no safety baselines, no transition pathways pre-positioned in place. Labor displacement outpaces retraining. You just can't keep up. And public anxiety, which begins quietly, soon becomes political. Humanoids begin to leak into security gray zones. Some are repurposed for illicit activities, theft, sabotage, coercion, etc. And because governance is weak in this world, or it hasn't kept up, enforcement cannot keep up as well. And it's important to emphasize that in this scenario, it can happen. We've had proxy examples where sudden technological accelerations just start to lead to a lot of surprise and shore up institutional brittleness. I would say that actually, for example, the advent of the smartphone and concomitant with that, the arrival of social media platforms and the algorithms that power it, right, and the way it's actually rewired society, so to speak, actually has shot up to a large degree the kind of institutional brittleness that we're talking about. And we're looking at a lot of catch-up initiatives to manage people and societies and how they interface with these kinds of technologies. So now, what should we look out for in terms of signals in this second scenario? First of all, I think you should look out for layoffs, because layoffs will be tied directly to humanoid deployment. It won't be a gradual attrition, but large, abrupt workforce reductions, because the rollout in and of itself will be quite significant as well. So that will have significant displacement impacts. Second, governments issuing emergency regulations or moratoriums because the normal regulatory process is overwhelmed. So they'll just say, stop guys, we need to take a complete halt here because the whole system is starting to get crippled because it just can't deal with what's going on. Third will be the rise of anti-automation political movements with that specific agenda of being anti-automation, anti-humanoid, so to speak. You'll be fueled by fear, misinformation, and economic insecurity. And fourth, any early signs of misuse, including theft, sabotage, and etc., which I talked about earlier, would also be another useful indicator. And in the interest of time, I'll skip over the risks because I think the signals are quite concerning enough. And I think we should just spend the remaining time moving on into the last few scenarios. Now, the third scenario is one of deliberate pacing. So it's a bit more measured, and that's why I call it the measured transformation. In this world, governments have strong governance capacity and act early. They actually take a safety-first approach. They create regulatory sandboxes, certification requirements, all the ethical guidelines are required before the humanoids are deployed at scale. Now, this is happening because the technological vector of development isn't as accelerative or fast as in the previous scenarios. So the rollout is slower. Adoption also arguably will be slower, maybe intentionally slower. Some kind of drag effects could be inserted by way of policy, or there could be some other reasons why that's happening. But an opportunity comes out of the situation where we can have a more structured, predictable, a more better cadence approach to trying to imbibe robotics and to make it part of our human world. So humanoids will begin in controlled domains in this situation. They will be deployed first to hazardous work sites, high-risk industrial tasks, logistic back rooms, and carefully monitored healthcare pilots, right? And they'll be ring fenced into these areas because the rollout's slow, there is some hesitancy, and one of the reasons I mentioned, and an opportunity is being exploited here, where policymakers can actually sort of keep a pace or get ahead of the situation. They can find the opportunity to communicate proactively and actually really dive into workforce transition programs and make sure that they are able to support society. Public trust remains high in this situation because people see the process as thoughtful, responsible, and accountable. And this scenario safeguards social cohesion and political stability. But it also comes with opportunity costs. Slow adoption may lead to widening gaps with countries that scale humanoids more aggressively. So if we think of a variation of this scenario where the slow rollout, the slow adoption is variegated, so to speak, is uneven. It's slower in some places, faster in some places, because the R&D initiatives may not be centralized in this world. Clearly, they're not in most of these worlds, where we're talking about the competitive nature of what's going on right now. In some places, the transformation or the rollout's faster, and some of it's slower, and therefore this leads to polarizing or gap effects. So we need to think about that. And let's move on to the fourth scenario. Now, the fourth scenario, which is called the missed window scenario, is the most quietly damaging. So something that is going to have rather destructive effects, but could easily happen without us noticing it, right? In this case, in this world, adoption is also slow, just like in measured transformation, not because of caution, but because institutions are weak. Regulations are unclear in this world. Policies are inconsistent. Stakeholders are fragmented, and political resistance or bureaucratic inertia blocks progress. Humanoid technologies advance globally, yet domestic adoption stalls. Companies hesitate. Investors pull back. Engineers leave for more dynamic ecosystems, or maybe even for more dynamic fields of engineering, provided they have the skills to support that, whether it's in quantum computing or advanced materials, and so on, as part of the unfolding fourth industrial revolution or even the fifth industrial revolution. Now, in this world, labor shortages worsen in logistics, construction, and elder care. So the aging population problem persists. The labor problem persists. Productivity stagnates. It's not solved. And over time, countries in this scenario become importers of humanoid technologies rather than shapers of them, with the caveat that there's certain key countries producing these technologies and hold monopoly over these technologies. The rest are just price takers, having to adopt these technologies in order to plug gaps in the problems that I mentioned regarding an aging population and the degrading labor force. Now, what should we watch for in terms of signals? I would say that here the indicators would be repeated delays, national apologies, implemented, right? Watch for companies. You also should track talent out-migration from AI and engineering sectors and observe whether foreign robotics firms begin acquiring local assets as a sign of rising dependency. The risk indicators in this scenario point to strategic erosion, growing dependency in hardware, software, and maintenance, and loss of economic competitiveness relative to neighboring markets, and rising wage pressures with no automation relief, and so on. So we have now explored four very different futures: a world of accelerated stability, a world of chaotic disruption, a world of measured transformation, and a world where nations simply just fall behind, or at least a good number of them, while others chug on ahead. Now, these four scenarios, once again, are not predictions, but I would treat them for the purposes of discussion and the work ahead of us as lenses, structured ways to think about how the future may unfold depending on the choices we make today, because the future, after all, is what we make of it. Now, scenario one shows us what is possible when technology scales and institutions scale with it, right? It is the world of rapid but orderly transformation. The second scenario shows us where risks portend when adoption accelerates faster than governance. It's a world where instability compounds and systems fracture. Scenario three reminds us that caution and control can preserve public trust, even if it slows innovation. And the last scenario, as I mentioned earlier, warns us that inaction it's really not neutral at all. It's not a pathway it is a pathway, in fact, to strategic decline. So avoiding the issue altogether or putting one's head in the sand is not going to make anything better. Now, across these three worlds, I'll end up by saying that three insights, at least the three worlds that are quite debilitating, not the desired world of accelerated stability, I would say that from these more slightly disturbing scenarios, three insights stand out. The first is that governance preparedness is clearly a decisive variable, something we should invest more heavily in. The speed of technological change may be outside of our control, right? It largely is. Outside of the R&D community and the technology fraternity. It's really for most of us outside our control. But the quality of our institutions are not outside our control. It's something that we clearly can influence upon. Countries that build capacity early will remain resilient. Those that wait will be overwhelmed, quite simply put. Now, the second real risk is not the humanoids themselves. And I don't want us to walk away from this webinar thinking that the humanoids are the problem. It is a gap between what our systems can do and what we're ready to integrate into these systems. Where the gap is small, societies adapt smoothly. Where it is wide, disruption becomes instability. So something we need to think about, and we do need to monitor this gap that shows up in each and every society. And lastly, I would say that there are a few no regret moves that which hold true in every scenario. Can we move on to slide 18? I've sort of forgotten about the slides. Yeah, let's go on to slide 18. Yeah, so let's talk about the no regret strategies or the no regret moves. I think this would include the importance of building governance frameworks early, something which I touched upon just a few sentences ago, preparing workforce transition pathways, and developing sovereign capabilities in physical AI. I think these are strategic foundations that will shape every future that follows. And if we take these steps, we can actually shape the tipping point, which is why at the end of it all, I chose to punctuate the title of my presentation with a question mark rather than in the first iteration to make it an assertion and to make it rather deterministic or fatalistic for that matter. I think we can clearly shape the tipping point, provided that we take the science seriously and we do something about it ahead of the curve. Last slide, please. So what I would say to you at the end of this presentation is that I think we clearly stand at the edge of yet another new frontier. There are quite a few frontiers ahead of us, but this is one important frontier. And it's a moment when our tools are no longer just instruments. Humanoid robots will clearly become partners that will work in tandem, in collaboration, in concert with human beings. They will be living alongside us in our lifetime. And humanoid intelligence will challenge us. It won't always be a walk in the park. Clearly, it won't, by virtue of this presentation. It will stretch our institutions. It will test our assumptions and force us to rethink what work, productivity, and capability truly mean. But it also offers us a rare and extraordinary opportunity, the chance to redesign systems that were built for a different era, the old paradigm that I talked about earlier, and there are quite a few, to uplift human potential and to create a future that is more resilient, more inclusive, and more ambitious than the present. The tipping point ahead is no longer a disruption when we relook it this way. I would dare say it becomes an opening, a chance for all of us to lead with foresight, for companies to innovate with purpose, and for societies to actually grow with confidence rather than fear. And our task is not to resist this future, nor to surrender to it, but to guide it, to exercise agency, to meet acceleration with our wisdom, to pair innovation with stewardship, and to ensure that the technologies that we create ultimately strengthen the human story. Ultimately, what is this world without human beings? If we build the right governance, if we prepare our people and we lead with conviction, I'm actually quite confident that we will not simply adapt to the age of humanoids, we'll actually shape it. So the question I think that stands before us is quite simple. Are we going to allow ourselves to step into this future with hesitation or with a sense of imagination, audacity, wisdom, clarity, and courage? And I think this applies to a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with and the risks that we've been talking about over the course of the simulation exercise. And I think it's important that the world that we inherit will definitely depend on the choices that we make now. So I thank you for your time. That's the last slide, and that's the end of my presentation. And I look forward to any questions that you may have. And thank you for dealing with unusually long webinar.
Thank you so much, Graham. It was fascinating. We've already received some questions in the chat. You've answered some of them throughout this talk. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and write in the chat.
Yes.
I will actually start with one. So you mentioned humanoid robots in the battlefield, and I was really curious to hear your opinion about this wildcard scenario where Russia uses Chinese humanoid robots for Ukraine. So, what are your thoughts on this? Implications? Is it even viable?
That's a very good question. And it was a question I can dare say, having left ST engineering, even though I'm held by the Official Secrets Act, I can actually just generalize my experience, having looked at the Singapore case study, and actually it's not unique to Singapore, the first tier militaries of the world, whether it's that of the United States, Russia by a stretch, although arguably so, Israel, for example, the UK and Australia are also good examples. And there's first of all, I would start the answer by saying that it's serious thinking. So at the level of ideas, a serious investment into the viability of robotic warfare, put simply. And that's been going on for quite some time now. Actually, it's not a new conceptual idea anymore. And I would say that there has been serious investment in first-tier militaries to conduct research and development and to prototype and to field. And quite a few robots are on trial right now. Uh, the kind of systems that will not just revolutionize the tail of any military, the logistics and the support, the combat service support, etc., but the teeth of a military, right? Having robots that can operate in very difficult, challenging physical environments on land, uh, above water, below water, and in the air, and to prosecute military operations, not just as effectively as human beings. The stretch goal among first-tier militaries is to exceed that and to bring unprecedented levels of precision and lethality. So I think what we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is possibly a harbinger of what is to come. It's a very interesting story in itself, and I gave an interview in Nikkei Asia a couple of months ago on the topic of how the Ukrainian army actually started to take the lead in fielding drones and using and brilliant efforts at innovation and making do with whatever they had at their disposal to field rather extraordinary DIY drone capabilities, to drop grenades or artillery shells and conduct reconnaissance, etc. And we've seen over the last couple of years the tide shift because the Russians are now come onto that, and what they may have in their favor, which the Ukrainians don't, is either the ability to have more access to what's out there, so Chinese robotics, Chinese drones, but also to start a indigenous manufacturing capability and to produce drones at scale, or at least to reach scale very soon to come. And I've argued in that article that I think this will lead to a protracted situation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict because of the inflection towards drone warfare, which is getting closer to robotic warfare. So what I'll say is this: I think ahead of the guardrails and the ethical considerations and any of the breaks, institutional breaks that we need to put in to have a very well thought out conversation and investment in thinking on the not just the advantages but the immense risks and implications. I think that's not happening, and I think that the R&D communities, at the behest of their governments, are actually chugging ahead with these programs. So in my assessment at least, there is a rather significant gulf between where the capabilities are right now and where they're going to be going soon to come, and where those guardrails, regulatory frameworks, and ethical consideration that amount to the rules of engagement, the laws of war, etc., are just falling more and more behind as we speak. So I think this scenario of a chaotic tipping point is one that concerns me a hell of a lot. And I hope that answers the question. As we speak, I mean, these R&D initiatives are, are, are unfolding and leading to some really mind-boggling capabilities. Still tightly controlled, but I think it won't be surprising if we start to see um, combat robots working alongside soldiers over the next 3 to 5 years in the least.
Super interesting. Thank you. Another question from the crowd was, can you discuss more in your view that adoption of humanoids will contribute to more inclusivity?
Hmm. I mean, that remains to be seen. When I first joined ST Engineering in 2019, I wrote a LinkedIn article that came out about send in the robots and play of a song. In this article, it was actually became the work at ST Engineering for the next 5 to 6 years about not just focusing on the robotic side of the equation, but the societal side of things, because it's clearly going to be a two-way compact. Robots will be introduced into society, but human beings have to accept robots. And robots, I suppose, will also have to learn to live alongside human beings. So it'll have to be a partnership. But it remains to be seen whether this will happen. I think what needs to happen first is that we need to see a more significant rollout of robotics beyond factory floors and production plants and into 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 the public space, and to look at the interactive effects between human beings and robots. My personal take is I think we should invest more in robotic trials that focus a lot more on the socialization of robots. Oh, well, the two-way street of socialization, robots socializing to human beings and human beings socializing to robots. So I think it's early days there, but once again, I think there's an underinvestment in that area. There has been some work done quite a few years ago about the implications of making robots look a little too much like human beings. So this area of anthropomorphism and having robots look like us. Some limited studies have indicated, surveys and interviews, that robots that look like us may lead to another form of physical discrimination. And why counterintuitively it may make sense for humanoid robots not to look too human-like, for one. They look like us, then they'll start to be the sort of distinction as they're human but not quite, leading to all these intractable primordial problems we face in terms of our highly imperfect natures as human beings and not moving beyond that. So I think it's still early days, but I think the concern is a valid one. We have yet to know what those effects are until we have more and more robots introduced into society. But once again, I appeal to that scenario where the institutional factor should come in, right? We have to invest in those areas that can allow a meaningful introduction, acceptance of robots. If robotics is the way to go in order to help civilization advance, human civilization at that.
Thank you. Another question from the crowd, following up on the shared intelligence of the humanoids. Um, they're asking, does this mean each robot will communicate to the cloud? And are there approaches to detect and predict unexpected emergent behaviors?
That's a very good question. I mean, there are some questions earlier on that are also great questions, and I hope we have time to address them. Some of them are really technical, but just tackling this particular one, I'm grateful to Tracy Wilson for that. Um, yeah, there are concerns about robots communicating with the cloud. In fact, right now, the significant concern that we have about the evolution of generative AI and agentic AI, and there's some studies that have come out recently that I suppose it could be an imprint of who we are as human beings, and there's a school of thought that follows along this line, that AI manifests because of what we bestow on AI. And so we're seeing some sneaky behavior by AI where I'm not sure if this answers the question directly, but what's come to mind is this recent study about um, AI algorithms creating new languages that only AI entities can understand amongst one another, and humans can't. So there's been some anecdotal research showing that AI has started to do that in order to mask conversations so that humans can't tap into what AI entities are discussing with each other. And that's one concern there. And then this is compounded by the fact that there are other risk risks and vulnerabilities you need to think about when it comes to uh, cloud computing, right? And whether or not a cloud can be hacked, and whether or not even clouds can be hived off from human beings through AI intent, for example. So this question about approaches to detect and predict unexpected emergent behaviors is a fantastic question. I would assume, and of course I need to establish this as fact, and then my students on this call will know what I'm talking about, moving from presumptions to facts through through data. But I'll presume that it is an area that someone ought or should be looking at. But once again, I'm not confident that we're looking exhaustively enough and starting to sort of like interrogate and red team all the potential risks and problems that may manifest out of these unfolding technologies. So like in the class last week, we talked about the 10th man rule or the 10th person rule. I think in the R&D teams or in companies that are working on humanoid robotics, amongst other advanced technologies, I think it's incumbent on these organizations and these groups to have experts in there who are able to bring a great amount of imagination and creativity and to ask really challenging and disruptive questions in order from a design thinking perspective, most importantly, to overcome these emergent problems. So, in the least, I would say that we need to do a lot more. And my limited vantage point from the last few years is that not enough is being done. Or if the conversations are happening, these conversations are happening in silos. So we're still seeing a lack of integration and coming together of different groups of experts, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, coming to speak with engineers and other scientists to have conversations about the implications of artificial intelligence and by extension humanoid robots, and what can we do in order to avoid those problems.
Hugh, I think we'll do one last question from the crowd. Where does the ethical moral component fit in the layers? How would physical AI handle consensus building? This is particularly important in the security sector and targeting?
Mm. Well, currently it doesn't fit in all that much, but it can be done. I mean, in Singapore, what's very encouraging to me, and I think we need more role models such as the ones I've interacted with. I'm coming across more and more AI scientists who are telling themselves that in the spirit of lifelong learning and also the incumbency of making sure that you don't end up with a tunnel vision and narrow-minded approach to AI because all you can think about is the algorithm and the level of code and so on. I'm seeing more and more scientists trying to learn about philosophy and psychology and sociology and all these other important fields that I think will bring to bear upon the ethical and moral components that are being talked about here. And I think what may happen out of that is that eventually we'll be able to code for ethics and code for norms and values that can be integrated into algorithms to make sure that if there are in an Asimovian sense, right? There's laws of robotics, including the fact that what thou shalt not kill a human being, for example, or where those exceptions are, especially in the battlefield, and to be completely discriminate about that. But once again, I remain quite skeptical, simply because in my own limited interaction with engineers for a good 6 years and being a social scientist myself, even though I'm concurrently doing an engineering degree as we speak, that I find that the gap still remains quite wide. So barring those scientists who have who have taken it upon themselves to go and to be educated in the humanities and social sciences and those particular fields, or help them think and approach robotics in a more and to build in a more ethical, a more moral-based robot, if you will. I think that that is not it's not happening well enough. So this gap remains quite wide. And in my daily interactions with engineers, I find that engineers, not all of them, but a good number, a non-trivial number of engineers, just are not sort of habituated into thinking about the ethical considerations and the moral considerations, etc. So we do need to bring ethicists to the table. We do need to bring uh, psychologists, and we need to bring people with those relevant fields as part of the design thinking process, which underpins the bulk of robotic design today, to have better design robots that can actually hopefully become more discriminate if they or discriminate well enough if they're going to be introduced into the battlefield. But as for those of us who actually understand the nature of conflict, and the intractable features of war, the fog of war, so to speak. I mean, the complexities are just so multitudinous, so to speak, right? That we're going to need a very advanced artificial intelligence that's able to come to terms with that complexity and to learn well enough in order to transcend and overcome these problems. Which is why I think when it comes to dedicated discussions about humanoid robotics or artificial intelligence in the battlefield, I still subscribe to that school of thought that believes that the human needs to be in the loop always, and the final arbiter of who presses the button to launch a munition at a target should still be a human being. But that remains to be seen whether or not the human will have a place in the loop. I think there is another school of thought that is confident, and most of them scientists at that AI will be able to discriminate and take out the right target, and know when not to transgress certain laws in place and so on. But yeah, this is a very good question, and I think it's going to take up the careers of most people in terms of what they're going to do for their entire lifetime in the field of AI and ethics.
Thank you. So we're running a bit out of time, but I would like to finish the session with a Wikistra tradition, which is previously you outlined for kind of general scenarios for adoption, but I would like to challenge you to presenting very quickly one best case scenario, a specific one best case scenario for humanoids, one worst case scenario, and one black swan scenario.
Whoa, okay. Uh, yeah. Well, the best case scenario is accelerated stability. And so I will just make reference to the four scenario set that I have here. I think the accelerated stability scenario is the desired scenario, I would say, because on a technological level, I remain confident that this that the development towards fielding a viable humanoid robot is going to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later, um, based on some of the things we're looking at in that space. But I think that in this scenario, institutions have to keep up or get ahead of the curve. So that I think there's some over the course of my lecture, I talked about that. No deviation from the chaotic tipping point. I think that is the worst case scenario. But I can't help but say that right now I seem to be tilting towards that scenario, because we're just not seeing um, we're just not seeing those kinds of indicators or behaviors that would suggest that we're paying enough attention and care to the issues, as I mentioned earlier on. So best case scenario still remains accelerated stability, and I think the worst case scenario is still the chaotic tipping point. And right now, I think we're tilting more towards the latter rather than the former. But I'm highly invested in our current generation and the youth of tomorrow to try and do something about for all of us to do something about it. I mean, we still have time, but not much left.
And Black Swan scenario.
Oh, Black Swan. Oh gosh. The Black Swan scenario would actually be the Terminator scenario. I think, and that is not a Black Swan, is it? Because a Black Swan is something that comes completely out of left field. Maybe it's more like a Grey Swan, perhaps. But let me say this: in the discussions I've had with professional communities working on AI in Singapore and in Australia and elsewhere in the UK and elsewhere, the Terminator scenario always comes up because and it comes up amongst some rather serious people as a reference point. I would say that would be the gray swan, if not a black swan, where you know this idea of an AI singularity is achieved, and we're not just talking about physical AI, but perhaps AGI, physical AGI, perhaps. And systems get out of control, and human beings get looped out from AI-related systems, and AI-based entities start to dominate the world. That is not inconceivable. I mean, improbable, perhaps, but not inconceivable. I would say that's the black swan. Low probability, high impact. So black or gray, I think the Terminator scenario is not a scenario that we should take off the table right now.
Wow. That was super, super interesting. Graham, thank you so much for this talk.
My
And thank
pleasure.
you all the participants who joined us today. We'll have one last special webinar tomorrow on Taiwan. Uh, More than welcome to tune in. Yeah, thank you again. It's
Thank you
fascinating.
so much. Thank you for your patience, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thanks, Ali, and to the members of Wikistrat.